This is Beyond the Blue Badge, brought to you by the Microsoft Alumni Network, where we dive into Microsoft alumni stories that inform and inspire.
Welcome to Beyond the Blue Badge, Microsoft Alumni Network's podcast. In this episode, we're excited to dive into the fascinating stories of Microsoft Windows. I'm the Alumni Network CMO, Becky Monk, and with me today is Larry Herb.
Thank you very much, Becky. Great to be here another month. We've got some great stories for you this month. As Becky said, Windows. Now, Windows is such a huge topic. We're going to focus on a couple of pivotal moments in Windows history. First, how Windows became the power play for the company. Then, how Windows 95, with all of its innovations, really went a long way to fulfilling Microsoft's early mission of putting a computer on every desk and in every home.
Let's get right to it. Microsoft alum Brad Chase often talks about the big bets and the core initiatives that really made a difference for Microsoft. And one of the biggest was the bet on GUI, or graphical user interface, and the strategy to pursue the Windows operating system over OS 2. Brad was hired in 1987. Even before the official start date for him, he was asked with his incoming class of recruits to go to the Microsoft Applications Marketing Offsite. And the leadership team was spelling out the company's strategy at the time. Let's listen to how Brad remembers that pivotal meeting.
And there were lots of people there who were giving talks, Jeff Rakes, Jeff Sanderson, and many others, Phil Welt. And they outlined how the whole applications division strategy was to bet on GUI and Windows. Because at that time, Microsoft had a great business with MS-DOS. Windows was, not much of anything at that time. The applications division had great revenue from the Macintosh applications, where we were number one with Word, Excel, Works. But on the MS-DOS side, we were behind WordPerfect. We were behind Lotus 1-2-3. And the company had decided that the strategy to try to beat those companies with another better MS-DOS product wasn't going to work. Users just weren't going to switch. You have to have a really compelling reason for users to switch. And so they outlined the strategy at this retreat that if we got the world to move to Windows and came out with great Windows apps, then maybe since they were already switching to Windows, people would switch to Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, and what, of course, later became Microsoft Office. And so that was a formative experience before actually we even started. That was amazing because, of course, we came to work at Microsoft and then watched that strategy that was outlined before we even started play out and come true. And as we, sort of saw a computer on every desk in every home, running Microsoft software, we saw the applications division have great success with that strategy.
That strategy seems like a no-brainer now, but it wasn't always clear that that was the way forward for the company.
No, you're right, Becky. Microsoft was working closely with IBM and was working on Windows MS-DOS. MS-DOS stands for Microsoft Disk Operating System, and OS 2 in parallel. But when Microsoft and IBM parted ways, Steve Ballmer recalls that they really needed the Windows bet to work. In fact, he had one of his most famous moments on stage at a company meeting shouting, "Windows, Windows, Windows." Here's how Steve explains that do or die situation.
There's no question. We had to be all in. There was nothing else now except MS-DOS and Windows. We were petrified. We were going up against the bear now. And, it was an all-out war. We had to go beat IBM. Now, we had applications already for Windows. There weren't applications for OS 2. There was a lady named Ida Cole who ran applications. I was running system software at the time. And we really knew we had to win. This was a fight for survival. And we had some tools, and we got out there, and we were, selling. Early 90s, I remember we got our first big really big Windows order. It was from the U.S. Air Force. I remember that. We had a guy named Russ Werner, I think, running Windows at that time, and it's a big achievement. Switched in there someplace to Brad Silverberg, who we hired from Borland Software. But no, it was a battle in the early 90s, and we just couldn't afford to lose it. And we got some application momentum. IBM had a hard time getting OS2 to be right, and our applications and then third-party applications really helped Windows get going. But I can't remember when I would say we, quote, won. Windows 95 was obviously a major milestone because it was the day we could say Windows had arrived. Windows and DOS were now integrated. They were a beautiful product.
Windows 95 was definitely a game changer.
Oh, it was. It's probably one of the most heralded stories of Microsoft's history because this was the project, codenamed Chicago, that really made personal computers, well, personal. It went a long way toward the mission of putting a computer on every desk and in every home. It was just easier for the layperson to use.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting, Becky, is I was involved with that. That's where I got my start with Microsoft. Is my wife and I were living in New England, and I found out that Microsoft was working on communities, and I have a history of working in communities. So we wrote up a proposal, sent it to Microsoft, and they accepted it. And so I was running some of the communities for MSN, and MSN was launching with Windows 95. And of course, we all remember that iconic commercial, and of course, the start button, everything about Windows 95 really changed the game. But as you said, the design had to be easy for the layperson to use, and that wasn't a fluke. This was by design. Steve mentioned Brad Silverberg a little earlier. Brad was in charge, and here's how he described the project's mission.
We had a very expansive vision for Windows 95. We wanted it to be the operating system that brought the joy and power of personal computing to everybody, to people around the world of all different shapes and colors and backgrounds and professions, from moms and dads and kids and mechanics and spreadsheet jockeys and grandparents. We wanted this to be kind of that fulfilling that vision of a graphical operating system taken to the mass market, that something everybody around the world could and would want to use, so that they could be able to explore more, to do more, to be more productive, have more fun, do it more easily, more reliably, faster, but on mainstream, affordable, everyday computers. Computers at that point had gotten relatively more affordable and relatively more powerful as the Intel 386 chip became popular. It opened up the door to technological innovation that had really been blocked before that. And so now the mainstream computers that people were buying had the capability to be able to provide something dramatically more powerful, dramatically more easy to use, and be an incredible tool that people would be able to use. We want PCs to be part of your everyday life, not just something that you went to the office to bang out spreadsheets or word processors or fill out forms in a database, or something that techies came home with and built their own computers and twiddled around or played some computer games. We wanted it to be part of everyday life. That was the vision for Windows 95. And we felt that it was the right time because the technology had finally gotten to a point that we could provide that level of experience with mainstream computers, the ones that you just went down to Best Buy or whatever to buy. Didn't have to buy a high-end PC. Be able to bring that experience, the joy, because we all loved computers. We felt tremendous joy using personal computers, especially in this new modern style. We wanted to bring that joy to people around the world. And that was the goal.
Brad put together quite a team to make this happen and also took an innovative approach to get everyone rowing in the same direction.
It was a big challenge, for sure, to be able to implement this really expansive vision. But we had a great team. It was a small team. It was really kind of shockingly small in today's numbers. I think the Windows 95 team was about 360 people. That includes development, test, program management, product management, user ed, management overhead. It was a small team. We knew each other super well. I had great leaders with David Cole and John Ludwig, Brad Chase, other people throughout the organization like Ralph Leip and Moshe Lichtman, David D'Souza, and so on. People who shared this vision, shared this love for computing. We wanted to democratize computing, and we wanted to take it global. We wanted to make it worldwide. So we had a team really of true believers who believed in the mission. So we then took, I think, a fairly innovative approach to the development at the time, which was we laid out a set of principles for the project, what we wanted the product to accomplish. We call them at that time the 10 Commandments for Windows 95. We repeated them over and over and over so that everybody knew what they were. They could recite them. They could get bought into them. And then we were able to push responsibility down through the organization. We didn't need a lot of layers. There was a lot of trust involved. If they understood what the principles were.
So that was definitely a novel approach. When we were doing the interviews with the people who were part of Windows 95, they all referred to those 10 commandments. They included build a modern integrated project mode, 32-bit reliable operating system, create a new user interface that became what everyone now calls plug and play, and it needed to be global and accessible, and it had to be easy and fun. And Brad's mom, you're going to hear, played a big role in making it easy and fun for everyone. Let's listen to Brad talk about what they were trying to accomplish with the commandments and how they moved the needle in tech innovation with Windows 95.
The first one was build a modern, integrated, protect mode, 32-bit, reliable operating system. We didn't want to have DOS. We wanted to boot up into Windows, and it all ran in protect mode with 32-bit device drivers, and could be relative to the hardware requirements, be fast and robust and reliable. So that was number one. And we were able to build on what we had started with Windows Workgroups to do that. Number two was it needed to be easy and fun. As much as Windows 3.0, made steps in the right direction, they still weren't that easy. We knew we didn't want to have the file manager, program manager dichotomy. We wanted to create a new user interface that was easy to use. And in fact, as we talked earlier, the way I helped describe this to the team, and they really loved the idea, was we wanted it to be easy enough for Brad's mom to use. This was, again, early 1993, 94, 95. Computers weren't that common. Most moms, dads didn't really have computers. Dads did, might have been at work. But my mom had been interested in learning how to use a computer. She had a Windows 3 computer, and she couldn't use it. It was too techy. It was like not worth it. But she did want to play bridge online. She wanted to email her friends. She wanted, look up recipes or do that kind of stuff. And so whenever there was an issue that came up on making a decision about how to use the product, people would ask, is this going to be easy enough for Brad's mom? And she was a good proxy for everybody's mom. Everybody could identify that would their mom be able to figure this out. And that really, in fact, if you look at the Easter egg in Windows 95. Now, we don't have Easter eggs in products anymore for very good reasons, but back then we did. If you scroll through it, there's a dedication to Brad's mom and that was an inspiration to people to help make it easier. So that involved the new UI. It involved what we call plug and play. So you could just plug in the devices and have the device drivers be devices automatically recognized, device drivers be loaded. And it worked with legacy devices too, which was really, really hard. We developed a plug and play spec for new devices, new drivers. And in fact, the plug and play spec that we developed in 1995 is still the plug and play spec that's used today. The really hard part with plug and play was being able to defect and automatically install device drivers for legacy devices that were not developed for plug and play. And that turned out to be an incredibly difficult challenge, but we rose to it. We added long file names. Now, we all take that for granted today, as we should. But back in the old MS-DOS days, file names were what we called 8.3. It was 8 letters followed by a 3-letter file extension. Now, that's obviously archaic. And it was a very, very hard problem to solve, to be able to add long file name support in a backward compatibility fashion, so that if there was an application that was written previously that only knew about 8.3 names, but the user gave it a long file name, how would that application still work? It didn't know anything about long file names. It had 11 characters set aside for storing a file name. It was a very, very difficult problem that the teams in the past had given up on. They said, we can't solve it. But I went to the team and I said, guys, this is 1995. We are not shipping a product with 8.3. I'm not going to do it. You just got to go back and figure it out. They did. And they came up with a brilliant, brilliant solution. We added great multimedia support. We know that people like to play videos or play games. We developed DirectX for Windows 95, which had it was the game changer for the game industry. It was like the most significant thing that happened. It blew the game industry apart, because prior to that, Windows was a poor platform for games. It introduced a layer between the game and the hardware, and games needed very quick response to be able to provide the graphics and input techniques needed to have good gameplay. So most developers had written directly to DOS, where they could get direct access to the hardware. With Windows 95, we developed DirectX, so it was a controlled way underneath Windows for games to be written in a very high performance way. And it took over. The Xbox itself is essentially a DirectX machine. That's where the name Xbox was. It's a DirectX machine. It was all built on DirectX. So we wanted to make it easy and fun. The next thing was we wanted it to be connected. We felt that we were building on Windows Workgroups, but now the internet was taking off when we wanted people to be able to connect to the internet in a very plug and play, transparent way. Previously, in the earlier days, to be able to run a TCP/IP, which is a protocol, required setting up static IP addresses, setting up your subnet masks. So we at Microsoft took the lead to develop new standards for TCP/IP to make it be able to work plug and play. We developed ones to also be able to use internet over dial-up lines, something called PPP, a protocol for that. We developed that. We incorporated all that into Windows 95 so that people could, from day one, be able to use the internet out of the box. Those were the main feature areas. But then we added some requirements that made the project even more difficult. We wanted it to be fully compatible with the user's existing environment and run well on their existing environment and mainstream affordable machines. That meant all their existing devices, all their existing applications, and be able to run quickly. We wanted our target was on 8 megabyte machines. Now I'm talking megabytes, not gigabytes, megabytes. 8 megabytes, we would run faster than Windows 3.1 on all scenarios. And even on 4 megabyte scenarios, we would be able to run in single application scenarios. We would run comparable to Windows 3.1. And I did something which the team wasn't all that thrilled about, and I still get a lot of crap about, to be honest, is that developers are typically used to having very high-end machines that they write software for, and then check the software in, and then testing runs it. Well, I restricted the developers to have 8 megabyte machines. I wanted them to have the machines that our customers had. And I didn't want to have machines all from one company. I wanted them to have, a smattering from kind of a representative sample of Packard Bell and Gateway and Dell and Compaq and IBM and all the different computers. So I wanted them to be able to feel themselves every day the experience that our end users would feel. Now, did they complain that their compiles were slower? Yeah, they did. Do I still hear about it 30 years later? Hey, Brad, about those 8 megabyte machines you made us use. But you know what? The end result, I can't tell you that was the cause for our success, but we never let performance get out of hand. We never got to a stage where, okay, we're getting to the end of the project, but now it's way too slow. And we got to go back and find ways to speed it up, because every day the developers ran Windows 95 themselves. And if it was too slow for them, they were then motivated to make sure that it worked well and it didn't have the bugs. A lot of these machines had pretty crummy BIOSes. They were pretty buggy. But we had to work on them because this is what our customers had. We loved our customers, and we were dedicated to that customer end user experience. And so, they went through some pain that they probably didn't appreciate at the time, but when they saw how well the product succeeded, I think they're okay with it now. There were 2 other things that we wanted to add to those requirements. The first one was to make it global from the beginning. Up till then, software had been basically coded for English in the US. And that when you wanted to localize it for another country, another language, you had to go into the code. It wasn't just a matter of changing the strings for the menus and so on. You had to go into the code and make the change. It was very painful. We had a philosophy, because we wanted this to be worldwide from the beginning, of that the code would be entirely language and localization independent, and that every localization would just be a text file. We had a term for it called EJAL, English as just another language. And when we came up with this idea at the beginning, people thought we were nuts. Like, this is crazy. Nobody ever does it this way. It's just too hard. But we stuck to it, and we ended up being able to launch in 8 languages simultaneously.
Wow, so many of the things that we take for granted in personal computing today got their start with what Brad Silverberg and his team created.
Right? But to be a success, the public still had to embrace it. And Brad Silverberg tapped Brad Chase to lead the marketing team for Windows 95. If Silverberg took development to a new level, then Chase did the same with marketing. Let's listen to how Brad Chase thought about introducing Windows 95 to the world.
I wrote a strategy I called the Educate, Engage, and Excite strategy, the 3 E's, which was all about making Windows 95 a consumer phenomenon, to take away the fear of upgrading to a new version of Windows or buying a new computer with Windows 95, and to make it so exciting and have so much press about it that you just couldn't get away from it. And we succeeded on that strategy. The team I led did an amazing job. And I remember when we had a week of comic strips from Doonesbury lampooning Windows 95, I went to my team and I said, we achieved our goal to make Windows 95 a consumer phenomenon. We had marketing plans for every segment. So my team was divided. I had a business team focused on Windows 95 to business, which focused a lot on issues like how do you move an organization that's already using other PCs to Windows 95. We had a consumer group focusing on marketing to consumers. We had a group focusing on working with the PC manufacturers. We had a group focusing on working with software developers. So we divided it by customer segment. And the things we were able to do and the excitement we were able to create was amazing. We did, consumer shows where we went around and previewed Windows 95 before it was even available. We worked with the development team and Brad Silverberg to take the beta process, where we had the largest beta of a software product ever, and also use that as a way to make people feel more comfortable with Windows 95 and honestly hype it up a little bit. So we had lots of people using pre-release copies of Windows 95. And that was, sort of another thing we did. We did tons of PR interviews. I was interviewed all the time. Bill was interviewed all the time. It was a constant theme. So everybody knew Windows 95 was coming. And the product was late too. So in a weird way, that extended the hype time. And of course, we just did some things that were, sort of unique. We had the first commercial that Microsoft had ever done for a single product, the Windows 95 Start Me Up ads. But we had a whole set of things, and just word got out, and everywhere you went, you couldn't get away from Windows 95.
It was everywhere. In fact, if you were around at the time, you couldn't hear the Rolling Stones song Start Me Up without thinking about Windows 95 and the new start button and the taskbar.
But doing that commercial wasn't a foregone conclusion. Brad's story of how they ended up with the final commercial, it's a fun one. Let's listen.
So the Windows 95 Start Me Up story is just a gem of a story, just amazing. So back in the day when we had commercials, we wrote a creative brief, about a 1 or 2 page summary of what we wanted the ad agency to know about Windows 95 and what we wanted them to communicate in the ad. And so the way it worked is you gave them the creative brief, then they presented you concepts, and you would approve or not approve the concept. So they presented the first set of concepts, and I was like, no, you're not on strategy. And then they came back the second time. This was Wyden Kennedy, the ad agency, and they weren't on point again. I think they came down a third time, and then I rejected the concept 3 different times. And it wasn't that they weren't smart or trying hard. It's just my whole strategy about having a consumer phenomenon and what we were trying to achieve and to educate, excite, and engage, my 3 E's that drove everything we did, they were just not quite getting there. So the third or fourth time they came and they presented a concept, and they presented the idea for Start Me Up. And I loved it. I loved this concept. And they said, but there's a problem. I'm like, well, what's the problem? They said, we can't get the rights to the song unless we're willing to sponsor the next Rolling Stones tour for $10 million. And needless to say, I was angry because they knew we didn't have $10 million to spend on this. And I wasn't going to sponsor the next Rolling Stones tour. So I was pretty upset. And I'm like, well, okay, you present me a concept that's on strategy, builds on the iconic start button, is perfect for what we're trying to achieve to reinforce this consumer phenomenon, but I can't use it. Why did you present me a concept I can't use? And they said, well, we were hoping you would negotiate with the Rolling Stones. And I'm like, oh, God. Because my days then, every minute was scheduled and it was really hard. But I agreed because I liked the concept so much. So I flew to Amsterdam to meet with the Rolling Stones personnel. We were in an old ornate hotel, and the fans were outside mulling around trying to see if they could see the Stones. But we were negotiating with sort of their team that really actually managed their concerts as opposed to the managers. And we negotiated all day, and we weren't making much progress. And I had to get back. They said, well, let's negotiate all day tomorrow, and then you could come to the concert. I'm like, what's the concert? Well, the Stones were playing the equivalent of an unplugged concert. That was a big thing back then, MTV unplugged concerts, where a lot more acoustical and smaller crowds and very cool stuff. And I said, well, I can't stay. And they said, well, we have a dress rehearsal tonight. Why don't you come for the dress rehearsal? So I went to the Paradiso, which was still is a really cool venue in Amsterdam. And I got to watch a complete run through of the concert. They played everything. They stopped periodically to give each other a hard time. I remember Mick Jagger giving Ron Wood a hard time about smoking too many cigarettes and, stuff like that. And they did this unbelievable concert. And I was one of only 2 people in the entire place that wasn't Stones personnel. So it was really a special experience, a experience I'll remember the rest of my life. And at the end of the concert, this amazing, amazing concert, they came to me and said, so do you want to meet the Rolling Stones? And I thought to myself, well, this was like a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I can meet the Rolling Stones. It could be great. Or I can meet the Rolling Stones and they could ruin the experience because they're not very nice people. I don't know. And I didn't really, I wasn't, after you work at Microsoft, you're not that starstruck anymore. I'd met many famous people, so that wasn't really a big deal to me. And also I was still negotiating, so I didn't want to seem too overly eager. So I said, no, I don't need to meet the Rolling Stones. And half the people I tell the story to tell me that I was the biggest idiot ever for not meeting the Rolling Stones. And the other half tell me that I was very wise. Pick your position. I don't know. But I didn't meet the Rolling Stones. And we continued to negotiate by phone now because I was back in the States. And eventually I said to them, I had a number. The number was what Bill and I had agreed was the most we would pay. So we agreed on a price, and then they sent the wrong version of the song, not the iconic version. And the reason they sent that version of the song was they didn't have to pay one of their previous band members if they used a later version. But we needed the famous version. So we got the famous version of the song and said to them, look, we need it. And they agreed. And I heard later that Mick Jagger didn't want to do it, but that he was afraid to piss off Keith Richards, who really wanted the money. That's the story I was told. So they agreed. They sent us the real version. And they came to show it to me for my approval. And I remember I just had one comment. I said, you guys did an amazing job. The only thing I'm asked is that you make the ending more dramatic, because the ending of the commercial just didn't quite live up to the wonderful nature of the entire thing. And so they added an ending where a young girl turns around and looks at the camera, just as, sort of the commercial's ending, and it was perfect. And that commercial ratings were off the charts. And that was really maybe, still one of the most famous Microsoft commercials ever done.
That commercial and all of the marketing efforts paid off. When Windows 95 launched on August 24th, 1995, it became the world's most popular operating system. People were waiting in line at the midnight launch at their local electronics store like Egghead Software to get their hands on their copies. Now, reports show that 1 million copies flew off the shelf in the first 24 hours. More than 7 million copies were sold in the first 5 weeks and 40 million in its first year alone.
Yeah, the development and marketing teams were already working on the next big thing. But they did take time to celebrate before the product hit the shelves. And Brad Silverberg describes how his team celebrated when the software was released to the original equipment manufacturers to get Windows 95 installed on machines around the world. And he also talks about how the whole company celebrated.
We knew Windows 95 was going to be big. We could feel in our bones. We felt it was going to be a great product. There were actually 2 celebrations. The first celebration was on RTM Day. Now, again, people here today may not fully understand how software used to be. Back then, it was distributed on floppies or CD-ROMs. We didn't really have online ways of distributing software. So we had to release the product to manufacturing, what we call a golden disk, that got released to the OEM so that they could install it on their machines that could be ready for a launch. And that we could also then build packages that would be in the retail stores for launch day. So RTM Day was July 14th, Bastille Day. And David Cole and I signed the master disk in front of the team members. And we kind of went crazy on campus. We had a legendary RTM party that people still talk about today. That was 3 years worth of tension, stress, anxiety, hard work, long hours that just got popped like champagne. David, he had this little pickup truck, little red Toyota pickup truck. We bought cases of Dom Perignon, and we also bought some cheap champagne. The Dom was for drinking. The cheap champagne was for spraying. And we went pretty crazy on campus. We were running through the fountain. We were running through offices. We got pretty... I was reprimanded later by operations, but there were rumors of people riding motorcycles in the hallways of our building and all kinds of hijinks and stuff. But that was an incredible release of tension and pride. And that party, that celebration was really for the team. That was for ourselves. August 24th, general availability launch day. That was for the world. That was for the company. That was for the world. That was an event on campus. We had carnival atmosphere. It was a beautiful day. We schedule it. Usually we schedule an outdoor event because usually August 24th is a good day in Seattle. The previous couple of days, it was a little bit rainy and we were getting a little nervous. But August 24th, the skies cleared and the skies were full of clouds that looked like the box. And this is the box. This is actually the very first unit of Windows 95 that rolled off the production line. That was given to me as a gift by the team. The production line was then in Canyon Park, which is in the suburb of Bothell nearby. And I said, this is the first unit of Windows 95 ever made. It was produced Friday afternoon, July 14th, 1995 at 5:15 p.m. And I have not kept many mementos from my years of Microsoft, but this one will always be special. And the sky looked like the clouds and it looked like a divine omen. We had Jay Leno, as everybody knows, on stage with Bill. I got on the stage at the end. And probably the proudest moment of my entire career, not probably, certainly the proudest moment of my entire career was at the end of the event, at the end of the speeches, the stage opened up to reveal the entire development team sitting in bleachers behind in colored shirts to match the color of the flag, the Windows flag, to a standing ovation for all the attendees many of them were journalists. And journalists tend to be fairly critical people, not very sentimental about the companies that they're covering. And I could see tears in the eyes and the appreciation, the standing ovation, and the team standing up and cheering. It was quite a moment. And you can still get it online. It's on YouTube. You scroll to the end and see that moment is still an incredibly inspiring moment. And the pride of the team, that they put into that product, their hearts and souls, you could see it, and you could see the appreciation. I was so proud of that team. Still am to the day.
It really did change the world. Larry, you were there at the time at the company. What do you remember about the celebration?
Well, I have to tell you this, Becky, you can't overstate the impact that this had. There were a couple things going on. Of course, it was the massive shift to the graphical user interface, which we heard about. But it was also the PCs were coming into their own. You'd walk into a superstore and they'd be on every shelf. There were hundreds of models to choose from. So it was really a moment in time halfway through the 90s where the internet, the computer, everything was happening at once. And I do remember the celebration, the excitement, the jubilation, but it was interesting because we didn't really understand it at the time because we were so focused on delivering the product that it wasn't until, a year later, 2 years later, when we look back, we're like, oh, wow, that was a huge, huge moment. Certainly we celebrated, but we didn't realize it was the Windows heard around the world. And when we look back in our rearview mirror, just the incredible impact it had. So it was an amazing moment to be at the company. And I'm just so proud of everything that we've done. And I can't say enough about the memories and everybody that really helped to get us where we are. And we laid the foundation for what Microsoft is today, right?
Absolutely. Gosh, there are so many more stories about Windows 95 and all of the Windows products, but I think we're going to have to leave it at that today for this episode.
Yeah, we sure do. We hope you've enjoyed hearing these stories as much as we have. We have a lot more. So thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more episodes where we explore the stories from the Alumni Network's Microsoft Alumni Voices initiative. Now you can see all of the videos, read the oral histories, and don't forget to share your story at microsoftalumni.com. On behalf of Becky, myself, and everybody here, thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Make sure you leave a rating and review and share it with someone you know. We hope you join us again for the next episode of Beyond the Blue Badge.